it's better than nothing, but it just, you can. Yeah, that's good. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first of the 2017-18 season of the Lougheed College Lecture Series. My name is Kim Campbell, and I'm the founding principal of PLLC. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce our new lead instructor for the Topics in Leadership course. But before I do, I just have a very interesting and exciting announcement that I'd like to share with you. Following recent discussions with Syncrude, we are delighted to announce that they have generously agreed to provide a total of $500,000 to sponsor the Lougheed College Lecture Series for the next 5 years. As I am sure you know, the Peter Lougheed Leadership College relies upon the generosity of donations and sponsorships to provide our students and the community with exceptional learning experiences, such as the Lougheed College Lecture Series. And since the offer of sponsorship is only days old, we look forward to welcoming a senior member of the Syncrude team at our next lecture. And in the meantime, please join me in expressing our gratitude for their support. It's really terrific. This is the event that we're so delighted to share with the whole community, the community of the U of A and the community of Edmonton, plus the audiences to which we live stream our programming. Those of you who've been attending our lecture series as members of the community, not our PLLC students, our PLLC students have already met their new lead instructor for Topics in Leadership. But I just want to say, for those of you who remember, Dr. Rhonda Breitkreutz has been doing it for 2 years. She's on sabbatical leave, and we are thrilled that Dr. Naomi Krogman has taken over as the lead instructor of the Topics in Leadership course. You're going to very much enjoy her warm hosting of these events over the coming year. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you our brand new lead instructor, Dr. Naomi Krogman. Naomi.
Thank you so much, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell. I'm honored to be introduced by you. Yes, my name is Naomi Krogman. I am a professor in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology. I am also an Associate Dean in the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research. I'm pleased to welcome you to the first lecture in the season of the Lougheed College Lecture Series. Before we start tonight's lecture, I want to take a few moments to tell you about the context of the Lougheed College Lectures. The Peter Lougheed Leadership College is part of a broader endeavor called the Peter Lougheed Leadership Initiative. This initiative is a partnership between the University of Alberta and the Banff Centre. It consists of two distinct yet strongly interlinked components. The Peter Lougheed Leadership Institute at the Banff Centre, which focuses on executive education, and the Peter Lougheed Leadership College, which is for third and fourth year undergraduate students from across faculties here at the U of A. This initiative is based on a vision to create a leadership development program that is recognized as one of the finest in the world. In the spring of 2014, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell was appointed the founding principal, and the broad purpose of this college is to lead students to explore the question, what do leaders need to know? These Lougheed College lectures are part of an interdisciplinary university course called Topics in Leadership that is a required course for all Lougheed College students. This is a wonderful group of students, and they are here tonight sitting in the front rows along with their teaching fellows. Could you wave? Topics in Leadership students? Thank you. So the purpose of this lecture series is to expose students to cutting-edge research and ideas and topics relevant to leadership in today's diverse and ever-changing society. Because of the wide range of the excellent speakers we have coming to give these talks, we wanted to open up these talks to the public and the broader Edmonton community, so you can also benefit. So now, just for a few logistics. Tonight's event will run until 7:15. It will start with a lecture by Murad Al-Katib, followed by a conversation between the speaker and the principal of the Lougheed College, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell. When the event is complete, we will say goodbye, And the Lougheed Scholars will reconvene in their seminar rooms with their teaching fellows for the second half of the class. One housekeeping item. During this address tonight, we ask that you do not take any video or audio recordings. I would now like to introduce to you our speaker, Murad Al-Katib. He will speak about his own approach to leadership as an entrepreneur and what he believes is important for moving a startup company to a global billion-dollar company. Murad Al-Katib is president and CEO of AGT Food and Ingredients Incorporated. Murad is lauded as a strong financial and strategic business thinker, able to anticipate and mitigate risks in international trading and commodities. He has completed his MBA and then worked in trade promotion for the Saskatchewan government. In 2001, he founded Saskcan Pulse Trading, providing the nucleus of AFT and growing the company into a world leader in value-added pulses, which include lentils and peas, beans, and chickpeas, which I found out tonight Kim Campbell and I both share a love for. This company also markets staple foods and pulse ingredients for markets around the globe, including the Canadian startup company. So Murad has served on many company and ministerial boards that involve pulses, trade, and transportation of goods. Currently, Murad serves on the board of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and is the current chair of the Economic Development Committee of Regina. Mr. Al-Katib's awards are numerous. Just in 2017, just in this year alone, he's won the Oslo Business for Peace Foundation Honoree Award and the Ernst & Young World Entrepreneur of the Year. In 2016, he won the Ernst & Young's Entrepreneur of the Year Award for Canada and the Prairie Entrepreneur of the Year Award. Just last year, he also won the United Nations Association of Canada Global Citizen Laureate Award and the Profit Guide magazine's 30 Most Fabulous Entrepreneurs of the Past 30 Years list. He is also Globe and Mail's one of the Globe and Mail's Canada's Top 40 Under 40 and Western Producers List. He is one of the members of the list of the 44 innovators who shaped prairie agriculture. Please join me in welcoming Murad Al-Katib.
Thank you. Great to be here in the City of Champions. So wonderful to be here. I always love to be in Edmonton because I am an absolutely huge Edmonton Oilers fan. So I always feel, and I'm not one of those new Oilers fans. I'm one of those who suffered and celebrated for many decades. So great to be here with all of you today. As I was introduced, I'm Murad Al-Katib. I'm president and CEO of AGT Foods. And what I'm going to do over the next 30 or 40 minutes is just kind of take you through my story, actually, the story of, starting up a company and starting off, with a vision of how to build a, prairie agricultural-based company into a global leader. And I want to take you through a bit of my philosophy on, entrepreneurship, leadership, and, kind of finish off with a few tips that I want to give you guys as you go forward. So, I think that the proper way to start, though, is to really give you an idea of where I came from. And, I'm proudly a first-generation Canadian, so born to Turkish immigrants. And so my parents actually, when I look at the fabric of who I am, I came from a family, I would say we were community leaders in rural Saskatchewan. So my father was a country doctor. So for those of you who grew up in rural Alberta, you'll know how important the rural doctor is to a community. And my mother, I'm actually particularly proud. She came to Canada in 1967, didn't speak a word of English, learned how to speak English with us kids watching Sesame Street on TV. And in 1976, she was the second ever elected rural municipal councillor woman in Saskatchewan. And so if you think about that, an immigrant Muslim woman in rural Saskatchewan in 1976. I mean, that was an unheard of, type of barrier. And, so Jobs on Main Street was the kind of, discussion that I grew up with at my household. It was, the importance of economic development in a community. The importance of agriculture was, of course, a very important topic. And, I came from 5 generations of doctors, so it was almost, predetermined that I was going to become a doctor and I was going to take over the family practice, and, I was going to, continue in the path of, as I say, become the 6th generation. And, unfortunately for my parents, I was the disappointment, and, ended up starting a company and winning the World Entrepreneur of the Year, I guess. So, no, they're certainly not disappointed. They've been very, very supportive. But, I think that, as I continued on that path, forward and growing up, one of the things that, I said earlier is, economic development, agriculture, the sense of community were really important things, and a love for Canada. As an immigrant family, that was something that was kind of instilled in us. But in addition to that, my parents really gave us a sense that there was a world outside of Canada too that we needed to understand, that we needed to connect with. That at the end of the day, Canada is an important country and one that we should love, but it's one country in the world. And that's where I kind of got the passion, for international business. And, that actually ended up, taking me, to the University of Saskatchewan and then down to Arizona to the Thunderbird School of Global Management, where I did an MBA, and actually ended up starting my career at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. And so from there, I went from my MBA, I actually worked at the International Liaison Office for the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington. And so that was my first, foray into the whole international trade area. And then, I was a young man, I was 23 years old, and I had this, big dollar, rated, number 1 rated international management MBA in the US. And, I imagined I was going to end up on Wall Street or Bay Street or somewhere like that. But I had this, feeling that I really wanted to come home. And so I did what every, young man does when they want to, go home. I wrote a letter to Premier Roy Romano. And that's actually a true story, where I wrote a letter to the Premier and I said, you know what, Saskatchewan and Western Canada, we're a resource-based economy. We produce what the world demands, and what it's going to be, our success as a province is going to be based on our ability to monetize the emerging markets of the world, right? That, it was really going to be about having a trade development strategy that would actually capture the emerging markets in places like India, China, the next emerging markets, Turkey, South Africa, Egypt, Indonesia, Colombia. These were the future markets. Not that we were going to diminish our focus on the U.S. And, we look at the kind of focus we're in today, and, we recognize that reliance on the United States is actually an economic advantage, and it's an economic liability at the same time. And so one day my phone rang, and it was the Deputy Minister, the Premier of Saskatchewan. And he said, young man, I saw your proposal, and we're intrigued. That was the word that he used. And he said, come see me sometime. So I flew to Saskatchewan. And at the age of 23, I was put in charge of emerging markets trade for the government of Saskatchewan. And, again, it's a story I relate to you because, there was no job posting, right? There was no opportunity. I actually created it, and that's something that I'm going to kind of give you a bit through this theme of leadership, actually, is taking control of your own destiny. And so, that decision that I wanted to go home, I was going through what I would call the big fish, little fish, debate in my head, right? Like I said, the initial thought was I'd end up in some big, pond, and I'd end up working my way up, and, it was Wall Street, and I wanted to go where everybody else that I finished my schooling with was going to go. But then I realized that, what? At the end of the day, there was an opportunity where I could, go into an economy like Saskatchewan, and I would have an opportunity to do things there that I wouldn't have an opportunity to do in other markets. Right? So I was actually, in the vision that I could actually become a big fish in a little pond, and then I could always jump to the big pond later on. Right? There was a view that actually the big pond wasn't Wall Street or Bay Street, it was the world, actually. So how could I develop a company, and then how could I scale it internationally and become a global multinational? And that was the idea that I had. And so I packed my bags, and I, moved back to Saskatchewan. So I traded in Wall Street for Victoria Avenue on Regina, and went back and took that job, and spent the next 6 years in what I would consider to be a really great training ground for me. The Emerging Markets Trade Group, I had the opportunity to travel to 70 countries around the world in 6 years, developing Saskatchewan exports. And, it was really a focused strategy on emerging markets. And then, in the late 1990s, we were undergoing this massive transformation in agriculture, where, when I was a kid growing up in rural Saskatchewan, we just grew wheat, and then we grew an oil seed, which is now called canola. And then after that, we'd have to leave the soil to what we call summer fallow, which was black dirt, because after canola, summer fallow was necessary because the soil was so beat up or depleted from the oil seed rotation that they had to leave summer fallow. Or there was an option, though, that they could plant a legume, a lentil, a pea, a chickpea, because that crop naturally fixes nitrogen in the soil. It doesn't require nitrogen fertilizer. And so this, crazy little crop called lentils started to grow in Saskatchewan, and we started to look for markets for it because farmers started to grow it, and yet, there were really no idea where to sell it. So we were developing that opportunity. And, as I got more into it and looked at the potential of going to this, what we would call continuous cropping, where the farmers would grow cereal, oil seed, and then pulse crop instead of leaving it a summer fallow, was a real opportunity. And so, again, I looked at what I would consider to be, the big advantage, which was really Canada and the farmers. And, Saskatchewan is where it started. Now we're going to talk about Alberta too. It's really big in Alberta as well. And so, again, I always say I did what every young man does. My wife was 6 months pregnant with our twins. I quit my job. I moved to the basement of my house, took a blank sheet of paper, and I actually remember taking that blank sheet of paper and writing Saskatchewan, Canada down. I wasn't very creative, I was a business guy, right? So, don't give me, big marks for creativity. So my first company I named Saskcan. So that was, kind of easy. It was something I thought farmers would remember really easy. And so that's how I named the company. And I always kept thinking about, the overall view of, what I wanted to do. This transformation was happening. But could I not only participate in it, but could I drive the transformation? Could I be the one that would go community to community and convince farmers to grow lentils and peas? And, Sir Winston Churchill is one of my favorite, leaders, in modern history. And, he said, history will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. And if you think about that, it sounds like a very brash quote. But, at the end of the day, I always think, too, that I believe that history will be kind to me because I didn't actually wait to see what other people would say. I'm actually driving it, right? At the end of the day, seize your own future and drive your results, and it takes the guesswork out of what people think, actually. And you really don't care, actually, at the end of the day. So, this quote was in my mind of, how could we be involved in writing the history for, prairie agriculture? So, I remember the look on my wife's face when I said, I'm quitting my job. I was an assistant deputy minister at the age of 28 years old, and, in the Saskatchewan government. And, that was a job not only did I love, I was earning a lot of money. And, and she looked at me like I was saying, honey, I'm going to start a lentil company. And she looked at me like I was saying, I'm going to go join the circus, right? And, start a business, long hours, lots of work, but potential for big payoff, right? And, Michelle didn't talk to me for about a week, after I told her. She was literally, almost 7 months pregnant, with twins on the way. And like I said, I came home and said, I'm giving my 2 weeks notice and I'm moving home. And, but after about a week, her and I met at business school, and, we went through the plan. And the plan was, again, could we marry the productive capacity of agriculture in Western Canada with the global demand for protein? And could we marry rising population and rising income in the emerging markets to our productive capacity? And then could we make money doing that? And, the thought was that we could, and I'm going to tell you how we did that. So again, that Wall Street was gone. And, what was really in my mind then was the fields, in Western Canada and the opportunity that we could actually drive that acreage. And so I started up this little company called AGT Foods. And in 2016, Saskatchewan and Alberta, we planted over 12 million acres of lentils and peas. And so I did what I thought I would do for the first number of years. I went community to community, meeting with farmer groups, convincing farmers to adopt the continuous cropping rotation, to grow red lentils, because the world ate red lentils. And, Canada's become the largest producer in the world now. So we are 65% of the world trade of lentils, 60% of the world trade of peas, and we've created about $5 billion in new economic activity, over the last decade. So, this has become a real business. And, one thing I want to impress on you is, agriculture is not just about farming, right? It's really, an integrated supply chain, where we're producing products, we're adding value, and we're now shipping food products and ingredients to the world. And I think that, there's a really exciting opportunity, and we're going to talk more about that. So, that bright future ahead in Western Canadian and in Canadian agriculture, is really, really exciting. And, recently I have the opportunity, I've been appointed to be the National Strategy Chair for Agribusiness and Agri-Food for the Government of Canada on the what's called the new Innovation National Strategy Tables. And, this is actually a strategy table that we're convening with 11 other CEOs to look at how do we raise Canadian agri-food exports from 45 billion to 75 billion by 2025. And we believe we can do that. And so, again, that bright future ahead is one that, is kind of led this growth. So, that little startup company in the basement of my house went to one facility in Regina, which I built in 2003. 2007, I decided to take the company public. I was around 40 million in revenue. And I raised a little bit of capital on the Toronto Stock Exchange Junior Exchange, the venture. And I took that capital and I embarked on a consolidation growth strategy where I did 17 acquisitions in 6 years in 5 continents. And so we have 48 manufacturing facilities now, $2.3 billion in revenue, about 2,000 employees globally. And we account for about 22 or 23% of the world trade of lentils now. And so, that strategy was to take this Western Canadian base, grow it, and then expand into the US, into Australia, into Southern Africa. We expanded into Turkey. We expanded into China. So we've got operations all over the world today. So agriculture is not just food anymore. I mean, it's not just about the breadbasket. I really believe that, Canada's future is actually to be the first stop on the protein highway, not to be the breadbasket of the world. And, as incomes rise and populations rise in the world, people eat more protein. Now, we kind of make a bit of a mistake thinking that people just eat more meat protein. The truth is they eat traditional protein. In a lot of cases, traditional protein is vegetable protein. It's not meat protein. And, I like to joke, although I'm in Alberta, so I have to be careful because of the beef industry here. But, I always like to say, would you like to have a side of beef with your lentils? Right? So that's... kind of this trend of, the consumption of vegetable protein. It's not going to replace meat, of course. But, the bottom line is that, as we look at that opportunity, but I really believe that the opportunity is a challenge. 10 billion people by 2050. We have a critical problem in the world, and that's what I would say is urbanization and water availability is a constraint to agriculture in the world. If you look at 35% of the world's, water is actually used in agriculture. So from that perspective, water is a big issue, right? It's one that we have to be very cognizant of. And, when I look at, the young faces around the room here, I look at the consumer, the new consumer is driving new trends that the food industry is not ready for. I get to sit in the boardrooms of, companies like General Mills and Post Cereals and these types of companies who really actually thought that you guys would eat, sugary, carb-rich breakfast cereals just like we all did, and it would last forever. Right? And then all of a sudden, nobody wanted to buy these products anymore. Right? And the growth rate was going negative. I saw a Wall Street Journal survey the other day, and it was a group of millennial consumers. And 36% of those surveyed had never eaten a Big Mac in their lives. And 41% of those same consumer group had eaten at Chipotle Grill in the last 30 days prior to that survey. Okay, so, again, the consumption of things like black beans, red kidney beans, the consumption of vegetable protein, healthy meal alternatives, this is actually what the consumers are demanding. And, I mentioned earlier those twins. I have a son and a daughter. They're going to be 16 years old soon. My son, he's a boy, so he's not as bright as she is. But she's not an environmentalist at all. But Sarah is what I would call a highly intelligent, socially conscious young lady, right? She cares about her food labels. She wants natural products. She's not stuck on organic, but she wants natural. She wants clean label. She wants to know that the ingredients on her food label are in mom's pantry. She cares about the environment. She cares about water and water use, right? Those are important dynamics, that are driving, the protein sector and, the rest of the economy overall. I love the fact that, the governor of the Bank of Canada in a speech recently said, consider the hundreds of millions of people who are climbing the income scale in India and China. Their changing diet implies much more than just stronger demand for traditional protein, specialty crops such as lentils and chickpeas. Right? You've got, the governor of the Bank of Canada recognizing how important this is to the economy of our country today. Right? This is a competitive advantage for us. And, this is an opportunity that I believe can be scaled even further. And, that's what the kind of work we're going to be doing on the national strategy table. So that, trade, we're falling actually. We're down to number 5 in agriculture. And when you look at agri-food, we're at number 8, in the world. So we're actually punching, not up to our standard anymore. And, as the Canadian economy, we keep making excuses and talking about how everybody else is just getting bigger and they're catching up. And, we're kind of trying to say we're doing okay, but we're not. The bottom line is that we're losing ground, not only on an economic output basis, but we're losing ground on competitiveness. And the key to reversing that trend is innovation. The key to reversing that trend is market development in novel products. And the key is reversing the commodity cycle to make it, food, ingredients, value-added production, whether it be in oil and gas, mining, or agriculture. Right? The days where, let's just think about how many of you all probably had to study economics 101, whatever your number is here. Like, let's just think about fundamental definition of commodity is price taker, right? Okay? Who wants to be a price taker? I want to be a market maker, not a price taker. So at the end of the day, the commodity cycle in agri-food is different than that in agriculture. And so I think that's the future that we have as we continue to go along. So, that opportunity, as I said earlier, is leveraging the trends that we have, both in income growth, population growth, and then this new market. I knew I was in the right business the other day. I was in Toronto at the lounge, at the Air Canada lounge, and there was this guy there, and he was so angry at Air Canada, which is not unusual, but he was angry because there was no hummus in the lounge. Right? He was just, offended. Like, Madam, I asked for the hummus 3 times and they haven't brought it. Right? And I thought, wow, I'm in the right business, right? Because chickpeas and hummus is like making this guy crazy, right? And so, that's the kind of new market. The health, nutrition, and sustainability factors are driving things. And when I look at Alberta, you know what? It's actually one of the only areas in the world, the southern region of Alberta in particular, where I would call it one of the few all pulses regions of the world, where you've got, dry land and irrigation, where you can actually grow every kind of pulse that we grow. So that's an area where you can grow lentils, faba beans, chickpeas, white beans, dark red kidney beans, black beans. Most of the areas, like Manitoba grows beans, but they can't grow lentils. We grow lentils and peas, we can't grow beans in Saskatchewan. Right, so there's a really big opportunity to scale the acres, and Alberta farmers are actually taking advantage of that. Your acres are just going through the roof. It's the next frontier. It's somewhere where we're actually putting a lot of our investment dollars in now. So the proximity to the ports is an advantage for Alberta. Right, we're looking at Prince Rupert and Vancouver. Last time I checked, you're 800 kilometers closer. Okay, so that's an advantage, and your harvests are typically earlier. And there's this northern gateway opportunity out of the Peace River country into Prince Rupert. And, good container availability where we ship in ocean containers, so those boxes that you see. A lot of our shipments of special crops go in those boxes. And they get put on a ship and they get shipped all over the world. We shipped to 120 countries last year. So growers are really innovative here. Like, we see growers in Alberta actually embracing new crops faster than we're seeing in the other developed areas. I mean, Saskatchewan farmers are great, and they've done an incredible job, but they're really comfortable now growing what they grow. Alberta growers are coming into the market, new, and they're a lot more innovative and wanting to do more. So it's all about demand in Asia. I mean, at the end of the day, China and India is a normal consumption region, right? Dal, is consumed by, Indian consumers all the time. But what if I told you that, China has actually become one of the largest consumers in the world of peas now? But you know what? They're not eating any peas. 1 million tons of Canadian peas went to China last year for vermicelli noodle production. So they're extracting the starch, and they're making vermicelli noodles. Right? Chinese dumplings, Chinese mooncakes are coming from Canadian peas. So, this is, again, the opportunity that these crops are protein, they're starch, and they're fiber. And the different uses are kind of driving that. So, you know what? We've got a race on our hands, right? We've got a race where we're looking at that global race to protein and the ability to feed the world. But I don't think we've kind of just even touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of that opportunity, right? I think there's a lot more growth opportunity coming ahead. So I want to kind of switch gears now a bit to, leadership. What is it? Who has it? Okay, this is the age-old question of, are leaders born or are they, developed? And I think, personally, I think it's a little bit of both. I think that, within each one of us, we have leadership characteristics and traits. And some of us are more easily able to bring it out, and others need a little bit of help to get it out. My mother, tells the story that I actually started my first business when I was 4 years old. And, I remember saving up my allowance, and we used to go to Turkey in the summer times, and I would save up every penny. I would go look, for change in the couches even, and I'd save my money all year. And I remember the first day of school, it was like, I wasn't excited about school. I used to invest all my money in Turkish bubble gum. And I used to buy it in Turkey and bring it home, and I would sell it to my friends. Right? And so, school, the first day of school was like the most incredible day because I actually had a store now, right? It was my desk at school. I could open up my desk, I'd have my merchandise laid out, and, I could actually sell the bubble gum to my friends. And, so, that kind of entrepreneurial spirit, that thing was kind of inside me. But, when I turn around and look at it, I think entrepreneurialism, it does take a team, right? I think that, when I look at awards and things, the hardest thing I had to do during this whole World Entrepreneur of the Year competition was to actually talk about me, right? I had to say, I did this, I did that, but actually it was my team that did it, right? And, it's something that, you kind of get trained to talk about your team, and it is really important. But I tell you, certainly an entrepreneurial venture doesn't come from one person. It certainly comes from that team and that spirit that you kind of put in place as a culture. I think it's really important that, you challenge, your structure. And whatever you do, you don't have to be a business owner or starting a business to be entrepreneurial, right? I say if you're an accountant and you're working in public practice, you can still be very entrepreneurial. You can add that element to your clients' work, right? My lawyers are entrepreneurial, right? The firm I use in Calgary, I think, is one of the most entrepreneurial firms in Canada. It's about looking at the solutions, and trying to find different ways to do things. So I think that, again, in addition to taking a team, though, I think innovation, I mentioned earlier, our ability to transform our economy over the next, 10 years is how we're actually going to judge the economic success for your generation, actually. So it's a very critical juncture for our economy. Because as I said earlier, we're losing ground all over the place. Now, when I look out at the, young faces in this room, I feel optimistic, right? I feel optimistic that, the brain power is there, And, what I'm going to do is challenge all of you to start to think differently. And, innovation, is about embracing technology. I mean, the technology in agriculture is going to change over the next 10 years and 15 years. Today, again, we went through a crop cycle where I have to sit back in my office and collect data from all my different points, and we have to make a judgment about whether the crop is good or bad. And then we have to start waiting for the crop to start coming in to see whether the quality is good or bad. Well, the future is going to be that drones are going to be flying, and they're going to be collecting data. And satellite imagery is going to be tracking vegetative growth, right? And sampling technologies are going to be collecting reliable samples, and artificial intelligence and machine learning is going to allow us to analyze 150 different data points as it's being scanned once. Okay, that's the future of agriculture. It's not where we are today. Our days of being the lowest cost producer, we're not going to compete on that basis on a go-forward basis. We need to use technology and innovation to transform. Right? We need to use our system in agriculture of food safety, reliability, and technology to be able to reach markets. And those are the kind of things that I think, we have to embrace. Now, I'm back to Sir Winston Churchill. Some people regard private enterprise as a predatory tiger to be shot. Others look at it as a cow they can milk. Not enough people see it as a healthy horse pulling a sturdy wagon. Okay, again, to me, at the end of the day, leadership, the business has to be in the forefront in the development of this economy. Okay, and then Jack Welch said, "Control your own destiny, or someone else will." So I use the word destiny a lot because I do believe strongly that you have a path and you have decisions to make as you move through your leadership journey. And, at the end of the day, you can wait and let somebody else make decisions, or you can make decisions yourself. Now, entrepreneurism is really a solution, and I think that, when we look at principles, they hold true whether you own the job or do the job. One of the things that I turn around and say is, compassionate entrepreneurism or social entrepreneurism is really using investment in private enterprise as a means to solve society's problems. And one of the things that I've been given with this World Entrepreneur of the Year is a forum to talk about social conscience and social entrepreneurism. I actually don't believe that it exists as a separate pursuit. I believe that every business today, because the consumer has changed so much and that the consumer is demanding it so much, that every business must have social purpose as an integral part of their strategy. And I think that, again, this is going to be the mindset change that you are going to bring to the business world, right? Social purpose is no longer optional, right? Environment, the impact of you have on the environment, your investment in your people, your talent, how you affect the community around you. How do you fit in? I believe that entrepreneurs are going to solve safe drinking water. I believe entrepreneurs will solve food security, and I believe that we will solve, climate change. And these are issues that, again, the ability of entrepreneurs to be a part of that is, I think, very exciting. So I'm going to tell you, a bit of a story of what we did. In 2015, the Syrian refugee crisis was really in its height. And, there were around 6.5 million refugees that had been displaced and were actually in Turkey, in Iraq, in Jordan, and in Lebanon. And the United Nations was struggling for a response to feed 6.5 million people every day. And so this was an emergency response that needed to be done quickly, and donor funds were coming in, and they were struggling in a war zone to distribute material. And so we actually went to the United Nations, and we actually pitched them on a concept. It was a very simple concept where we would take 13 items that needed to be distributed to a family, and instead of them trying to distribute all of those items separately, we would consolidate them into one carton box. We would put it into a tamper-proof carton, and we would allow them to distribute it per family unit instead of individual items. So we put in that box lentils, chickpeas, rice, pasta, tomato paste, vegetable oil, tea, sugar, salt, canned tuna fish. We put in canned faba beans, right? And we distributed this concept to the UN of these parcels. And they said, you know, the problem is it's going to cost us a lot more, and we're dealing with donor funds, and so we don't know if we can do that. We said, look, let's do a pilot. We think we can save you money on your distribution costs and your losses in distribution. So we did a 20,000 carton pilot program with the United Nations. And in 2016, we distributed 4.5 million cartons that accounted for 700 million refugee meals. And we saved the United Nations $18 million in distribution last year. And we did that as a profit-making business, right? We did that as a part of our business. And, you know, it was a very effective program, you know, where, again, it's been used as a model. International Red Cross, Red Crescent embraced the program as well. And, you know, that program continues. The cost savings came from losses. They were losing up to 7% of their product in distribution because it was in a war zone. When we took away the individual distribution, put it into consolidated cartons that were more easily controlled in a warehouse environment, they were able to get the product to their need quicker, and they were able to make a really big difference. I believe that youth entrepreneurship works. Okay, and you know, one of the things that I want to, you know, continue to have you think about is I think that entrepreneurship is a viable career. And you know, youth adopting the mindset, if I can't find a job, I'm going to make my own job, you know, I think is a very, you know, interesting dynamic. And you know, SMEs in this country are the fabric of our economy, small and medium enterprises. And you know, one-person businesses that go to two-person to four-person to eight people, you know, those are the future of our economy. And you know, I think that, you know, at the end of the day, you know, one of the things that we're going to be pitching in this national strategy table is, you know, a strong focus on youth entrepreneurship. So developing that ability to recognize the opportunities, give the young people the tools to capitalize on them, and the direct link between education and real-world success. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that you're getting here, you know, at the Lougheed Center with your LEAP program, for instance, which I think is really fascinating. Am I saying the right word? The LEAP program? Is that what it's called? I mean, it's really cool. Like, you know, having you guys stretch out of your comfort zones, right, to get experience in things that you're not, is that what it's called? Stretch experience, okay. Sorry, I thought I was using the word leap. Okay, it's the stretch experience. Now you guys all know what I'm talking about. Okay, that's really cool, though. I mean, I think that it is a leap, though, out of their comfort zone to stretch. So, you know, the stretch experience, I mean, that's the kind of thing that's really going to build you skills, you know, that are really helping you to not only identify what you need to work on, but taking you out of that comfort zone and giving you those skills that'll stay with you, you know, as you move forward. So I want to, you know, let's take a look at some of these here. I want to look at the PayPal one here. The very first company I started failed with a big bang. The second failed a little bit less, but still failed. The third one, you know, proper failed, but it was kind of okay. I recovered quickly. Number 4 almost didn't fail. It still didn't do really great, but it did okay. Number 5 was PayPal. Okay, you know, Sir Winston Churchill said, success consists of going from one failure to another without lack of enthusiasm, right? So, you know, from that perspective, I mean, you know, or I love the Zappos founder, don't be cocky, don't be flashy. There's always someone better than you. Okay, you know, again, control your own destiny, but don't go crazy on thinking that you know everything, right? So that kind of takes me to the end of what I want to go through, but I want to actually, you know, kind of give you a bit. I thought through, you know, what I would think are my 10 tips for success. Again, Sir Winston Churchill said, the price of greatness is responsibility. And, you know, I can tell you that, you know, running now a multi-billion-dollar company, I don't view it as that I employ 2,000 people. I view it as I'm responsible for 2,000 families. And, you know, I think that is, you know, a very important aspect of how, you know, we've run our company, and you know, it's been very, very, very successful. You know, I say the cliche, have no fear, but I want to really qualify that one for you guys. I'm a very systematic thinker, and I want to encourage you to do the same thing. You know, fear comes from the unknown in a lot of cases. right? Leadership, at the end of the day is your ability to not only know your vision, but to communicate it effectively and to show that vision and the path. So why I have no fear is I actually go through, the scenarios. I go, okay, if I do this, that is going to happen. If I do this, that could happen. If I do this, that's going to happen. I'm going to choose this one. Now, I might be wrong, but I'm never entirely wrong on what the outcome is. At least I'm making much more of an informed decision, right? So I'm never afraid of the outcome because at least I've thought through what the outcomes are. So, you guys are all really computer savvy, but we'll remember, decision trees, right? We used to do decision trees where we would go, okay, if I do this, these are the potential outcomes, right? Do that type of systematic work in your decision making. Predictive analytics are going to be at your guys' fingertips where you're not going to have to do decision trees, but you're going to have to pick your data points and you're going to have to make informed decisions. So I have no fear because I make informed and calculated decisions and I take informed and calculated risks. Business is a constant job of sales and marketing. Whether it be to my banks, investors, my employees, my farmers, my customers, right? It's a constant job of sales and marketing. So again, know your vision, communicate it effectively, and figure out exactly how you're going to sell that vision. You have to lead by example. One of the first things I do when I walk into a factory is I pick up a broom. I sweep the floor. Okay, I never enter a factory without the proper safety equipment. Okay, because how can I expect everybody else to be safe if I'm not willing to do it myself? Okay, so those are the kind of things that you really got to keep your feet on the ground no matter how big and successful you become. Lead by example. Right? I cleaned the fridge out at my kitchen in the office the other day. It was the grossest, most disgusting thing I've ever seen. Right? But it was, leading by example. Invest in your people. Again, it's something that seems like such common sense, but so many companies fail in professional development for their people. And I think that, again, it's professional development, it's mentoring, it's encouraging, that innovation spirit, right? It's people working outside of their job, having time to think through innovation. Those are the type of things that I encourage you to embrace in your own business culture, as you have an opportunity. The difference between a good leader and a great leader, I meet so many CEOs and leaders in the world, and I got to tell you something. It's literally shocking to me that you'll literally see, a leader and, 27 minions around them that are exactly the same as them or, cut from an exactly similar, culture or structure, right? I think that's the most dangerous way to lead, right? I want people around me who are absolutely opposite to me, right? I want people around me who challenge. I want skills that I don't have or that I want fed into the mix. I want to succeed by seeing my people succeed. Right? I'm not threatened by their success. I'm strengthened by it. That's the difference between good leaders and great leaders. Great leaders surround themselves with complementary people. I think that's a really important thing that, you have to get comfortable enough with your own, ability so that you're not ever caught in that view of being threatened by it. Fundamental economics, right? We talked about commodity earlier. There are no free lunches. Okay, so if you're in business or you're, starting your career and somebody says, oh, well, I'd love to do that for you. There's no charge for that. Let me just do that for free for you. Nothing's free. Okay, I don't want to be, the pessimistic, whatever guy, but at the end of the day, you can still accept it, but realize that someday in the future there's going to be a payback. And just walk into it with eyes open. And know that there is a give and take like that, right? But there's no free lunches. So I think that's really important to kind of, train yourself to recognize that. The Bill Gates rule for young adults: you're not going to be a vice president right out of school. You're not going to have, an expense account, and you're not going to fly on the corporate jet. but if you work really hard, you can earn that. Okay? So, now, have you ever heard the term gray matter? Gray matter is brains. But in leadership and in business, gray matters. So experience is really important. So as you embark on your young, career, have a mentor, right? Choose a mentor carefully. It could be a, family member. It could be a business associate. It could be a former professor. It could be another entrepreneur, but ensure that you do that. And then when you're in a position to start hiring staff, recognize that, you might be in a different generation, but there's actually a lot of benefit to, benefiting from the mistakes that other people made. In our company, we don't like to punish mistakes. We punish repeat mistakes, right? So at the end of the day, we all make them, but I pretty much made every mistake that, any of my staff could ever make, and I've figured out how to solve it, and so from that perspective, it really, really matters. And I think that, the most important thing I want to leave you with is have passion. For whatever you do in your life, right, embrace it, love it, right, and, have passion for, the life that you've chosen, for the future that you have ahead, and, be excited about the opportunity, because I think that, I'm going to turn 45 on Sunday, and I wish I was back, at, 25 again, because I think that you guys have a very, very exciting, decade ahead of you. And it's going to be one that's going to be just absolutely dynamic. So good luck to it. I'm looking forward to spending a bit more time with you guys. I'm going to end right there.
Thank you. That was fabulous. Are we using mics here, or are we just talking about it?
I have a mic, and they told me that you like to put one on.
Okay. As opposed to putting people.
Yeah, there's one right here.
Right there. Oh, okay.
There you go.
Well, that was wonderful. I bet you didn't realize how exciting agriculture was. Don't you want to go out and buy some acreage and throw in some lentils? That's fabulous. I am one of your big customers.
Great.
Because, hang on, let me turn this on. Hey, voila. Lock. I'm a big red lentil soup maker.
There you go.
And in fact, you will find in all of the freezers, because I have several different places that I live, you will find packets of lentil soup ready so that when I come and I want something to eat, I just thaw it out and eat it, and it's the yummiest stuff, and I will share my recipe with
There
you
you
all
go.
at some point.
I want that recipe too. So
It's really, really good. Sorry, I'm just going to find where I started my notes with you here. That was so interesting. Now, one of the things, we're going to have a little chat, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. But one of the things I thought was really interesting was you said you had a chance to become the 6th generation doctor in your family, and you said no. And that to me is such an interesting lesson about following your own passion. How did your family take that, and how did you know you didn't want to be a doctor?
I think that, when you're growing up, it's almost like a path that was kind of, chosen. And, I embraced it too. But, again, it was that passion I had for the rural economy and agriculture and, my desire for this international business side that, it was grade 11 actually, where I went to my father and mother and I said, first of all, I'm smarter than the average bear. So I figured out that the best thing to do would to be to convince my father that I was going to be another profession, because he's a professional. So I said, I'm going to be a lawyer, Dad, instead of a doctor. And he was cool with that. So I went to business school and then ended up, pursuing the MBA. But you know what? They've been very supportive. And at the end of the day, the economic opportunity, it was a tough time, right? We were talking about the late 80s to mid 90s. In fact, you know how tough it was. You were our prime minister, and it was a very tough economic period in this country and one of transition. So, you got to follow your heart. You have to, drive that destiny. I'm a firm believer that we all have a path, and that, the decisions we make take us in a different direction. And so, you've got to be very calculated about those path decisions.
But your training was in business and international business. How did you sort of get your head around, how did you get into the nitty-gritty of the agricultural side of it? Because it's so interesting, and as you point out, understanding the science of nitrogen-fixing crops and what that could mean. Where did you come to learn that?
I at the beginning, you've got to really rely on the resources around you. And, as a young entrepreneur, I had to skip part of the story, but to kind of let you in, I took that blank sheet of paper and I had a pregnant wife, and the problem I had was I had no money. That was a problem, right? I didn't have the technology. That was a problem. And but I had a vision of what I wanted to do. So I found a partner. And so I actually went to a company in Turkey, one that I had met, that we were selling them lentils. And I said, hey guys, you're number one in the world today, but if you don't invest in Canada, you're not going to be number one in the future. And so I challenged this small family company in Turkey who'd never made an investment outside of Turkey to believe in the story. And they gave me $1 million of capital. And we started the company. And then 8 years later, I bought their company for $104 million.
And they're laughing now all the way to the bank.
Well, no, they're still partners, so
Yeah.
It's worked out well, but yeah.
But that's, that is so interesting. One of the things that also, points out that if we're smart enough to use it in Canada, the fact that we have Canadians with roots from all over the world, if we're smart enough to see where that, or people travel back to their countries of origin, even if they're born here, and learn about, there are opportunities, not just to do business, but to learn from what other people are doing and seeing the process.
Listen, I look at the, at the Asia Pacific Foundation board I'm on, the diaspora and the students. This is the future. Yeah. At the end of the day, we have a Canadian, ambassador set of students that have graduated and went back to their countries, and ones that are coming here that want to stay. The monetization of that opportunity to take, ethnic and cultural diversity in our country and to make that into true business connections, we have not done a good job of it. In fact, we've done a really poor job of it.
How can we do it better?
I think that, again, it's a challenging period because we're one that, we continue to talk about how we're culturally diverse. Yeah. And, listen, in this city, you're mourning. You had a terrible incident this last weekend. But these are the type of things that happen, but it can't take away our resolve to recognize the ethnic and cultural diversity of this country. And that, that's our economic advantage going forward. So we have to encourage it. We have to become part of global value chains. We can't, recognize that, or we can't just be reserved to the fact that, we're going to build our companies, rely on the U.S., and then somebody's going to buy us. Yeah. We need to build, and you have to take decisions. We as a company took a decision recently. August 31st, we announced that we were partnering with Prem Watsa at Fairfax Financial, and Prem put $190 million into AGT, and we announced that we're going to build a $10 billion Canadian agricultural company that's going to acquire other foreign companies instead of being acquired. So that's our vision of what we're going to do with our company. So we got to seize the opportunity.
And to what extent do you think that Canada, being a country, democracy with the rule of law, how does that attract investors?
I think it attracts investors for sure. And I think that, again, the governmental stability that we have here, listen, we've got a real, challenging political environment in the U.S. that's not going to go away in the near term. I think that creates an opportunity for us, not only in two things. One is it's actually pushed us, it's kicked us in the butt a little bit to get on with this diversification. Right? The Canada-Europe trade agreement came into effect recently. That's an important agreement. Free trade with China is essential. The recognition that India is an economic superpower that's emerging quickly, and that we're behind in terms of that relationship. These are essential parts, and from your history, you were a free trader. And you've been
It's the issue that
preaching
brought
that.
me into federal politics.
Exactly,
Actually, yeah.
exactly. And I think that we took a bit of a break, actually, where we went to multilateral and we said, well, we're going to be a part of the world community and let them solve it. It's not going to get solved that way. We got to have our own agreements. Canada has to find our own future.
Yeah. You talked about the importance of innovation, and one of the things that you'll see when you talk to our students, but this is an interdisciplinary group of students. And one of the reasons why we're interdisciplinary is the opportunity for students to see how other disciplines approach problems, and to find the synergies. And what I find is really interesting is the notion of making vermicelli noodles out of peas. So you think, okay, I'm going to grow peas, and peas are really good, and they're full of protein and everything, but you transform it into a totally different product. Who's doing that kind of research? Where did that come from? Is this something where there's lots of potential to develop all sorts of new products? I mean, certainly in terms of the need for protein, animal protein. I mean, there are now ways of making protein sort of that mimics animal protein. But is this sort of part of the future of
this is the future. I mean, at the end of the day, today, if I was to tell you, 62% of the products on the grocery store shelf contain corn, right? And most of that corn is genetically modified. And again, I'm not arguing the GM or non-GM. I'm actually arguing that consumers today are demanding non-GM. So it's not the science discussion, but the opportunity now to reformulate everyday foods and boost the protein, boost the fiber, boost the micronutrients naturally. That's where the future is. And our industry association, we passed a strategy where we're saying we'd like 25% of the product grown in this country to be used in food ingredient applications by 2025. And we're having success. I mean, Sun Chips, Frito-Lay just launched a new Sun Chip, and on the back of the bag it says, as delicious as 2 peas in a pod, right? Because yellow peas are the #1 ingredient in that Sun Chip. And just launched in every Subway restaurant in the U.S. And it's really selling well because it's higher in protein, it has a higher fiber. It's still not great for you, but it's better. But there's certainly products that are going to be improved quite dramatically.
I'm just going to
It's not only, sorry, one more thing. It's not only about just protein too. It could be about calorie reduction, fat reduction. Vegetable protein is a lot more healthy than some of the dairy-based proteins and animal proteins in terms of that.
I'm going to ask you one more question, then I'll open up to the floor for questions. But the other thing is, if you look at the challenge of climate change, one of the producers of greenhouse gas are farm animals, and from methane from one end and carbon dioxide from the others. So as millennials become more concerned about these issues and more interested in vegetable things, there's an opportunity to actually shift some of the greenhouse gases by moving to more plant-based proteins. And I think this is, you're suggesting that maybe younger generations are going to be leading that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the consumers are demanding it. And I think that, again, one of the things that we get caught on is whether it'll be a substitution. I think that the pie is growing so fast that what we're going to see is vegetable protein, being a dominant force in terms of the growth side. And I think that that's a really great opportunity for us as we go forward.
The other thing one more thing I was going to say, when you talked about making your own job, I think that's so important. And it's interesting. My husband has done that as a musician and an actor. Has created his own company and tries to encourage other people to be entrepreneurial. So it isn't just in something like agriculture, whatever. I think whatever your passion is, whatever you do, think about how you would like to do it, and how you could make your own job doing it, what you would need to do that. And the one thing about our students is that they're so networked with one another. There are incredible opportunities. But I thought that was a really powerful thing. You did that. I mean, you made your own job.
I mean, people don't believe that it truly was a letter to the Premier. And but at the end of the day, I didn't just write a letter that said, oh, hey, here's what I'd like to do. I wrote a proposal. I put some work into it, and there was enough interesting stuff in there that, again, I created my own opportunity.
Yeah.
And, I got to tell you that I've seen a lot of young people come in, interviewing for jobs and positions with our company who've really done their homework. And they come in and they actually have an idea of something that even isn't what we're advertising for. And we've hired some of those people.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important aspect of preparing yourself getting ready and seizing that challenge and opportunity.
They didn't know they needed you until you proposed it. They go, yeah, we need this. This is amazing.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to open the floor to questions. Does anybody like to make a question? Particularly for our students who are not going to go to the master class. Comments, questions? Was that a hand up back there? I can't see.
I think we got one over here too.
Yeah,
So there's a microphone there.
Yeah.
Or a box.
Yeah, we have these little
There you
throwable
go,
microphones.
catch box. I like that.
Yeah.
So speaking in terms of international business, recently there were few regulations laid out by Indian government regarding the fumigation process. So as a company, how do you address those challenges coming from developing nations? Because
at the end of the day, non-tariff trade barriers are very, very difficult for business. And, this is one of the reasons that I advocate the bilateral free trade agenda. Because if we have a bilateral free trade agreement, we have dispute resolutions already built in. We have clarity on things like phytosanitary issues. Today the Indian government has said, we want you to fumigate cargo in Canada with not with methyl bromide, but with phosphine. Well, we don't have any pests of concern here. So the Canadian environmental regulation doesn't allow us to do it, yet the Indian government's requiring it. And it's a challenge. The fumigation exemption ran out on Saturday. And so today, technically, Canada can't ship to India. But we expect it by tomorrow or the day after. Today's an Indian holiday. It's a national holiday today, so by tomorrow, we're hoping they're going to say something positive. You just got to stay on top of it, and we have to be active in governmental policy, convincing them to move the agenda forward.
the second part of my question is, how do you predict the demand coming from developing nations? Because this year, as posted by the Department of Commerce, the imports were reduced drastically as compared to the previous years.
Yeah, the problem we have in all these emerging markets is statistics are very unreliable. And when you come to food policy, in particular in my business, food inflation is not only a governmental priority, but governments are elected and defeated by the price of lentils. So, from that perspective, it's really important because food policy in emerging markets are really, really critical. And so, in a lot of cases, we don't rely on publicly available statistics. We actually have to have our own people on the ground feeding us the market intelligence. This is a really important part of looking at the new information age. Information is so readily available at your fingertips, but in a lot of cases, it's information. Intelligence is what you should make business decisions on, not on information. Because that stuff that's out in the public information, usually, it's either been absorbed into the market already or it's wrong.
Did we have a question over here? I'm sorry, I'm blind as a bat. We have a hand here, sorry, I just can't see.
And here, and then one at the back there after.
Yeah.
You're next at the back.
Okay. Obviously, you've had crazy success, but were there any times where AGT was close to the brink, or you lost kind of your
Oh
focus
my
on the
gosh,
vision?
so many times. I mean, we talk about, that's been interesting. You look at it now and you see the success, and my CFO Lori, she was employee number 2. She's still with me, and we talk about days early on where we would look at the different regions of the province, and there'd be farmers that we knew really well. And, I used to say about, joining the circus, I used to say to my wife, honey, don't worry, I'm a juggler now. I know how to juggle money, right? So, we had times where, we had money in our bank account, but we knew we had receivables coming, but we had payables to pay. And, I remember sending checks out to farmers and intentionally forgetting to sign them. But I'd do it to farmers that I knew. I mean, I was always going to pay them. I tell them now, I thank them and tell them, hey, I sent you a check that I didn't sign. But, at the end of the day, we did what we had to do to make it work. And then, if you think about it, I mean, I took the company public in 2007, and the 2008 financial crisis, U.S. financial crisis, 2011 European debt crisis, Arab Spring, the Middle East market, I mean, these were all generational political events. I mean, I remember days, I called my office in Egypt and I go, we need, like, we've got like $5 million in inventory sitting in Alexandria port, and Mubarak falls, the government falls, and I'm like, we need to get, security around our warehouses. And so, we get that all done, and the next day they call me and they go, boss, we can let them go. The lentil bags are too heavy. They want TVs, not lentils. Right? So, there were a lot of challenging times over the years that, we had to really look at the business strategy. But at the end of the day, we focused on the farmer, focused on quality, and focused on, innovation, factories, technology, and then it scaled.
It sounds like there were some tough times, but like, were there times when you personally fell off the wagon? I mean, you have to lead thousands of people. What did you do to like get your focus back or get back on it?
Oh yeah, I mean, listen, I think that looking back, I did rely on a few mentors. So I had my business partner who did the first $1 million investment. He was always a calming influence because his family had been in the business for a number of decades. So, he was one that would assist. But, in addition to that, I relied on my wife, Michelle, a lot. She was perfect for me because, well, she is still. She's still around. She still kept me around anyway. She had a business degree, but she wasn't in my business. Okay, and that was really great for me, actually. It was a sounding board. It was somebody who could actually tell me I was stupid and I was doing the wrong thing, and so that type of help. And then my management team. I mean, my CFO, Lori, she's been with me. She's another entrepreneur. She was a single mom who left a multi-billion-dollar company, and I signed her paycheck with my pen. I remember the second Friday, she's like, it's payday. And I was like, oh, okay, what do we do? So she calculated out what I was supposed to pay her, and I signed a check and I paid her. So, I relied on my management team a lot.
Can we, yeah.
Somebody at the very back, too, has been waiting, so we'll get her after. Right at the back in the blue. You had the same question? Okay.
You can probably just throw it.
Right here?
These are
We've
throwable.
got one up here, I guess. She said she's answered already.
Oh, okay. I'll come
Yeah.
to you next. So I'm curious to know when you made the decision to quit your full-time job and to start your business. What were some of the factors that really impacted that decision? And
So I wouldn't recommend doing it exactly the way I did it, okay? Because, for me it worked out, but, I like abruptly quit my job and, started. And, the decisions in my case were, look, I had this, top-rated MBA education and 6 years of good business experience. I thought, what's the harm? I'm going to go start a company. I'm going to get this incredibly great business experience. And if I fail, I'm going to go work for somebody else again. Right? That was the kind of the vision I had of it, that the downside was way less than the upside. Now, that being said, in hindsight, I probably had, 3 months of savings, which was about all. And so it was pretty risky, actually, but it worked out. That was one of my less calculated risks, probably. Yeah.
And then we have one more up there.
Yeah, it definitely built, over years. I mean, because I spent about 6 years in government, and I kept seeing the opportunity, and I kept, developing it more in my head in terms of what it looked like and what the critical success factors were. So, I guess now you're having me think about it. I probably did prepare a lot more than I'm actually thinking I did. But what I meant earlier was, most people would start, and keep working while they started up and did it. But I think I was much more abrupt. But it was just time for me. I was 28 years old. It was a transitional period of my life where I had, kids on the way. And I had a wife that was, relatively supportive. And, the opportunities, and I think that you guys are going to be faced with this too, because the economy is going to be so dynamic in the next decade that, again, I say that's where I would be excited to be in your position. But I think you guys are also going to be faced with some tough challenges, right? Where, those dynamic opportunities are there, and first mover advantages are real in these opportunities. So, but just remember that passionate thing I said earlier, like, the fact that I believed in the rural economy, agriculture, communities, international, feeding the world, environmental sustainability, all of that interwoven together, that social purpose, it made me so passionate that I was probably a bit blind.
I think we have one more question very quickly, and then we'll break up there. Do we have a microphone?
Mr. Al-Katib, I enjoyed your talk very much. I'm wondering, what role, if any, does government have in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship?
Oh, geez. Yeah, we could spend about 6 hours on that. But government's role is to create that environment for us and get out of our way. And, I think that, at the end of the day, governmental policy, for whatever reason, continues to go down a path of taxation, not innovation, right? I'm a believer in innovation, not taxation. We need to reward, innovation and gains. I mean, it goes to everything that from, carbon tax policy to, taxes on small enterprise to, all of these things where I look at it, government has focused so much effort on, taking a piece of the pie instead of growing the pie. That's where I've been a bit excited by this recent move. Dominic Barton, the global head of McKinsey Consulting, headed up the Committee for the Economy, the Growth of the Economy for Bill Morneau. And that committee has actually filed on some really interesting recommendations. These national strategy tables came out of that. So there's going to be 6 national strategy tables charged with pathing forward a platform for innovation in each one of these sectors and to grow by billions of dollars. So there's now finally a focus on growing the pie instead of just redistributing the existing pie. So, this governmental focus that, I don't know who's assaulting the middle class, I'm not sure, but they're under assault. So we got to figure out, first of all, who's doing that and get our mind off that and focus on growing the economy. We lose sight of the fact that jobs create economic prosperity. We lose sight of the fact that the trade imperative in Canada is for the wealth creation of all Canadians. And I think that, we've lost sight of that a little bit over the last decade or so. Well, I hate to have to pull this conversation to a close, and some of our lucky students will be continuing it in their masterclass. But I want to say to Murad Al-Katib, this has been incredibly interesting. Whoever knew that lentils were so exciting? I knew they were delicious. But I think what's so interesting about what you've talked about tonight is this integration of different ideas. The business smarts, but also the vision to see the future and what is needed. Actually, the excitement of the different crops. I mean, when you talk about in southern Alberta growing all these different pulses, I mean, what you learn about agriculture, about the land. So it's the old is new again, in the sense that it's an old industry, but now with so many new different insights, and what it means both for feeding our planet, for doing so in a way that doesn't hurt the environment, that grows our country, and that I think you're having a lot of fun too. Having a lot of fun. So thank you so much for being with us this evening. You've been a fabulous kickoff to our Lougheed College lectures. Thank you so much. Great of you to be here.